if it's proven that it was, this is a major escalation by Russia. But those arterial routes, we've seen it in the air because Western aircraft are using their radars to look into Ukraine. They're in international airspace. They can't be attacked. But Russia knows they're providing support. They know Poland is providing support through the rail networks. Therefore, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're targeting those. And that will be something that Poland will ramp up pressure. And I have no doubt at all that the West, NATO in particular, will take that very seriously if it's proven to be Russian involvement.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a military analyst and co-founder of the Red Matrix Productions. Sean, welcome.
Louis, it's always a pleasure to join you.
Well, it's great to have you back, Sean. Zelensky today, that's the president of Ukraine, of course, is visiting France to sign a deal for 100 Rafale fighter jets. We'll come on to the role of these jets specifically in a moment, but how capable is that aircraft and how long might it take to get Ukraine's pilots up to speed on them?
Yeah, it's a fascinating deal, isn't it? I mean, I know it's captured a lot of the headlines, particularly President Macron keen to demonstrate that France is able to export stuff to Ukraine. The one thing that Ukraine isn't really short of, though, is aircraft at the moment. It is worth pointing out that the F-16s that were gifted to Ukraine, I believe there were about 100 that were gifted, but to date they've only delivered a very small handful of those because Ukraine just doesn't have the pilots available to fly them. It's also because Ukraine doesn't actually have the experience to fly Western jets. It's not just about the jets, it's deconflicting all of the surface-to-air missiles and the air defense systems to stop your own people shooting them down. My understanding is that I think they've lost 4 F-16s already in the short time they've had them. And there's also a whole load of Ukrainian pilots going out and doing pilot training elsewhere in the world at the moment. So, yes, it's a good deal for the long term. In a decade's time, I suspect these Rafales will form a really important part, a cornerstone of Ukraine's air defense capability and air power capability. But quite bluntly, in the next year or two, when Ukraine needs all the help it can get, I'd be very surprised if we see any Rafales in combat in Ukrainian Air Force's hands.
So how is Ukraine currently using its fleet of Western aircraft and where would Rafale fit in? I mean, if it's coming such a long way in the future, is it expecting to even be used in this current conflict? I mean, we have heard it's well suited to long-range strikes, but perhaps that might not be its role then if it's so far down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth remembering that, I mean, this is close to my heart as a former fighter pilot. You know, when we first heard F-16s would be given to Ukraine, we sort of went, even if you park the 100 F-16s on the lawn outside President Zelensky's palace, frankly, they wouldn't know what to do with them. And there's two big issues here, one of which is Ukraine still flies. It doesn't have an independent air force. So it is simply an air arm of the army, airborne artillery. And therefore, Ukraine doesn't have the benefits of what the United States and the UK has, an independent air force. Our doctrine and everything is tailored accordingly because it's not just about the aircraft, it's how you use them. And the doctrine, in other words, how you use them, Ukraine is not going to be using them the way that the West would use Western air power. As a result, the F-16s are largely airborne artillery. They have been using them to shoot down cruise missiles, etc. But one of the frustrations I know from personal experience, having recently been out to Ukraine, is that Ukraine really needs to start embracing Western philosophy in terms of air power, because that's how you get the best out of your air force. So whilst there's no doubt at all, the Rafales have some amazing capability. And if there was an independent air force there, and if they were able to dovetail those aircraft with experienced pilots who had several years' experience, I think they could be incredibly dangerous in Ukraine's hands and pose a real threat to Russia. I don't think we're going to see any of that anytime soon.
And obviously these fighter jets have been at the front of a lot of the publicity around this deal, but there are other weapons as well that France is selling or providing to Ukraine. What else have we seen?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, this is what I got far more excited about because I saw the Rafales, 100 of them. It looks a big deal. It's an incredibly expensive deal and captures the headlines. But underneath the surface, there are also some air defense missiles and particularly what they call the SAMP-T, which is a French missile that is a surface-to-air missile. Lots of batteries of these things, but they carry the Aster 30, very potent Mark 4, Mark 5 air defense missile that not only shoots down cruise missiles, also has a very effective against ballistic missiles. That's the other thing that is hurting Ukraine. And most symbolically for me, most of the weapons that the West has given Ukraine has been older weapons. Things like in the UK, Storm Shadow, it's 30 years old. We bluntly don't want these weapons to fall into the hands, or modern technology to fall in the hands of the Russians. Therefore, we're happy to let the Ukrainians have older stuff. But these French missiles, these SAMP-Ts, I think they only entered service just after 2010. They're a very modern missile, very capable. They're entered into service with the French and the Italians, I believe. So I think this is a really interesting step forward for the Western coalition, France in particular, because now they're putting much more modern equipment into the hands of the Ukrainians. That caught my eye more than the Rafales did.
And Zelensky is also going to visit the Coalition of the Willing headquarters in Paris today. Of course, it's the European military alliance that's intended to provide troops to support a peace agreement in Ukraine. But without the US and Russia coming up with some sort of peace plan, which seems to be the only way that a deal is going to get done at the moment, this alliance seems a bit impotent at the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. A warfighter perspective like myself, let's get these things in order. You've got to actually stop the war first before you decide how to keep the peace. But let's be absolutely clear. What you don't want to do is then try and work out what you're going to do when peace breaks out. The Gaza conflict is a good example. President Trump seems to have imposed a deal, but there's nobody there to fill the vacuum and actually start to keep the peace. And that void creates problems. The one thing you don't want to have in Ukraine is a void, and therefore this work is probably invaluable. But the point you make is that, bluntly, at the moment, Ukraine is on the back foot. I'm sure we'll get into it, but on the front line, things are not looking good for Ukraine at the moment, all of which means that there seems to be very little appetite for President Putin to stop anytime soon. So the real question that the Western alliance has got to wrestle with is not what to do when peace breaks out, but how on earth to exert enough pressure onto President Putin to make him come to the table, to make the war stop. Because unless that happens, it's going to be an incredibly precarious and difficult winter for Ukraine.
Yeah, and there was some sort of push towards these talks by the US. We had that Budapest meeting, which then seemed to be shut down by Russia's foreign minister, Lavrov. He appears to have been perhaps told to go back into that meeting in Budapest. Do we think Russia was waiting for Pokrovsk to fall before calling that meeting officially and saying they wanted to go into it? Lavrov did disappear from the spotlight for days afterwards, after seemingly crashing the idea of those talks. So was there maybe a bit of an internal struggle in the Kremlin? Or is this just another one of these strange delaying tactics that Putin seems to use whenever we get to some level of progress?
It's a great question, Louis, but the fact remains is that if I knew the answer to that, I'd have to be inside Putin's head. There was lots of speculation, wasn't there, that Lavrov and Putin had fallen out. For what I gather, one of the things, it's all very well having an autocrat like Putin, but the real power lies in some of the people around him, some of the oligarchs, because ultimately, when they realize that life is just getting worse and worse, they're the people who normally bring a dictator's life to an end. And therefore, the whole breakup with Lavrov, whatever the truth was, it is just interesting to see that frictions are just starting to appear. But the harsh reality, going to your core of your question, is the difficult situation at Pokrovsk on the front line. Is that something that President Putin is actually ready to negotiate about? I think it's highly unlikely. I think what's far more likely is over the last few weeks, you've seen President Trump start to harden his view a little bit more to Russia. He's starting to talk about more sanctions with any countries that are doing deals, buying energy from Russia. We've heard overnight more Ukrainian attacks over Russian energy infrastructure, none of which is going to bring the war to an end tomorrow, but all of which ramps up pressure on President Putin. The one thing that I think we're going to see a bit more on the table will be these Tomahawk cruise missiles. You'll remember that it appeared that President Putin was worried about those, and that's what prompted him to call President Trump and stop him issuing those to Ukraine. But I do sense that America's patience is gradually wearing thin with Putin. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we may not see Tomahawks, but we may see more and more American support for long range missile strikes. And in addition, it's not just the missiles that potentially the West could give Ukraine, but also helping Ukraine develop their own. There's quite a few missiles at the moment that Ukraine has been using. The Neptune missile, we understand, was what struck the oil fields the other night. That's a Ukrainian missile. And the Flamingo is another missile, long-range missile, developed by Ukraine, but with the help of the West. They get past some of the diplomatic challenges, so we say, of giving missiles to Ukraine. If they can develop their own, they don't have to do any testing. They just send them off. And if they work, fantastic. And we're seeing more and more effect there. So the short answer is I don't think we're going to see President Putin suing for peace anytime soon unless Trump pulls some of the levers that he has available, and then we might see some movement.
So is this a kind of key area that Ukraine and its allies can kind of needle in towards Putin in the Kremlin? Because, Russia's Novorossiysk port is just today, it's one of the biggest Russian oil export ports. It's just today resuming oil exports after a 2-day pause following Ukrainian drone attacks. Putin himself has actually been in meetings with Rosneft, which was one of the sanctioned companies that was sanctioned by the US very recently. Is that pressure starting to build? Do you think this is something that Russia will actually sit up and listen to, whereas earlier they've kind of tried to push away the economic situation as just a sort of economic management issue and something they could deal with more a larger war economy?
I think this is at the heart of the question, to be honest, Louis. I think you can either, and the war will stop when Putin achieves his military objectives. We can speculate what they are, but it looks very likely that they are Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, as well as securing Crimea as well. He hasn't done that yet. And it might be that just to secure Donetsk could actually take 2 or 3 more years. The only other ways that this is going to end is either Putin is forced to militarily or economically. It doesn't look like there's any appetite in the West to get involved militarily. But I have to say, there's more and more talk about the West putting a no-fly zone in place. There are risks associated with that. But I think the big strategic error that President Putin made was by 19 drones that went into Polish airspace, some into Romania, the 3 fighter jets that went into Estonian airspace. All of those were avoidable. And if President Putin can't be trusted not to attack NATO, then NATO is entirely justified in pushing out its boundary and creating a no-fly zone to protect its airspace. And by doing that over some, not all, but some of Ukraine, I think is one way that they could ramp up the pressure on President Putin at minimum risk. But the only other way, as you say, is doing sanctions. I, as a warfighter, I have to say I'm somewhat cynical about sanctions, but I'm also aware that there are now fuel shortages in some parts of Russia. That's building up pressure. It's also that the exports aren't generating the money that used to come in, and that's funding. Was it 40% of national spending in Russia is now on defense? It's costing a fortune, this war. It's a lot of people. Over 1 million Russians have died. The whole fact of this, the impact on the society and on its economy, all of which is gradually ramping up pressure. Will that cause Putin to come to the table? Probably not soon, but the further that pressure ramps up, the more unstable Putin's position becomes internally, and that will be something that will worry him.
And I do want to come on to some of the geopolitics of this, especially attacks on Europe, as we've seen quite developments in Poland in the last few hours. But just finally on the air attacks on Russia, Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation is claiming that Russia's struggling to defend energy sites, in part because a lot of these air defenses that they would be using are needed at the front lines in Ukraine. How difficult are these decisions for militaries about where to utilize air defenses? And does it seem that Russia has been slightly caught out here with something of a shortage or an inability to bring enough defenses in to cover their energy infrastructure?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the trouble is with air defences, they range from a man lying on his back with an AK-47 pointing into the sky. That doesn't cost very much, and you could probably have quite a lot of those. But that's not very much use against cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. If you go at the high end, the only real defence against ballistic missiles is incredibly expensive missile systems. You know, we talk a lot about the American Patriot system. You're talking about $1 billion. I'll say that again, $1 billion per unit. So if Louis was responsible for protecting the UK and I gave you 5 of those systems, where would you position them? Would it be around the military bases that are actually doing the war fighting? Would it be around your politicians in the centre of London? It's an incredibly difficult decision to make. And Russia is a vast country. A lot of the oil infrastructure is spread in the middle of nowhere, and therefore very, very difficult when you have these limited resources to work out. So, they will all have some formal protections against some of the slower drones. As soon as you get onto the more capable missiles, particularly some of the ones that are being developed, like the Flamingo missile or the other missiles that Ukraine have been using, a lot more difficult. You need specialist equipment, particularly the Neptune missile, and therefore that is something Russia does not have in large quantities and therefore has to prioritize.
And we mentioned attacks in Europe a little earlier. An explosion that has hit a Polish train on the line into Ukraine is apparently a deliberate attack, according to Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. The Polish government says it's definitely an attack by foreign state services. Why do you think we're not seeing this sort of European-wide response that Poland is calling for?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think both you and I have probably been on that line, haven't we? I've certainly been on that line when I've gone in and out of Ukraine. Let's sit back a little bit. Russia knows full well that there's lots of supplies coming to it from the West, and inevitably wants to target that. It wants to stop those supplies coming in. Explosions on the Ukrainian rail network. Each time I go into Ukraine, you look at the beside the lines, there are huge quantities of sort of repair kits for the rail network. So they are very quick now at repairing should an explosion happen. That's not quite the same in Europe. And it's another example of why if you threaten Europe, you scare Europe. And all of a sudden now, that they may have implications for how the appetite for Poland to actually provide aid to Ukraine. I've got to be careful here because Donald Tusk thinks that it's Russia, and it's a bit like that puppy next to a pile of puppy poo. It was you, wasn't it? But we can't be certain at the moment that it was. But if it's proven that it was, this is a major escalation by Russia. But those arterial routes, we've seen it in the air because Western aircraft are using their radars to look into Ukraine. They're in international airspace. They can't be attacked. But Russia knows they're providing support. They know Poland is providing support through the rail networks. Therefore, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're targeting those. And that will be something that Poland will ramp up pressure. And I have no doubt at all that the West, NATO in particular, will take that very seriously if it's proven to be Russian involvement.
And we were discussing earlier the somewhat more serious position that Ukraine has found itself in on the front lines in the battle against Russia at the moment. A lot of that centered around this city, Pokrovsk, which Russia has been trying to seize for at least 18 months now. It's still trying to finalize the capture of the city itself. But the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, which does a lot of reporting and follows what's going on with this conflict, has shown footage of Ukrainian troops pushing back the encirclement of a large contingent of Ukrainian troops in nearby Mirnohrad. That's just north of Pokrovsk. How difficult is a sort of fighting retreat in this situation? Because that seems to be what we're seeing in this city now. Should we expect a withdrawal of those troops that are kind of almost encircled north of Pokrovsk? Is there something here that would be worth fighting for? How difficult is that situation now?
It's a very, very difficult situation. I think it's worth, as you said, it's been 18 months, I think, for Pokrovsk. And if you remember the battle for Bakhmut, right back at the start of the war, I think Russia lost 30,000 soldiers. It was the time for Yevgeny Prigozhin and his team fighting with convicts and the like. Russia has learnt a little bit from that and does a more encirclement now than just walking into the city and getting shot at and just gradually taking ground. Pokrovsk looks like it's fallen. Yes, there will be no doubt mopping out. Mirongrad up to the north, that would be encircled, all but encircled. And therefore, if you left soldiers in there, they could fight stoically for a while. But the problem is, eventually, that they would be terminated, either captured or killed. And that's one thing at the moment Ukraine cannot afford, to have its soldiers captured. I think if you look back more strategically, the very fact it's taken so long for Russia to take these, the next three towns to the north, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, are the key ones. They form the rest of the sort of the Donetsk region, the powerhouse of Donetsk region. They're the real prize, because if they don't fall, they provide a barrier to stop Russia getting into the rest of Ukraine. If they were to fall, it might not just look like a boundary to those of us in the West, but there's huge areas of open land beyond, and that would make life very difficult. A lot more territory would fall to Russia. But most independent analysts believe that this would take at least a couple of years based on the current progress. So I think my own view is that this will be an elegant withdrawal. It'll be a fighting retreat. And bear in mind, the one thing that I think a good close friend of mine had advised me after I came out, don't forget that Ukraine's strategy here is to make Russia pay a very heavy price every foot, every pace they move forward. And what the advantage they have is they dig in very established defensive lines to fall back to, so that the Russians have to come out of their defensive lines and are exposed. Ukraine can then move back to pre-prepared defensive lines and use the drones and use the artillery to heap a lot of misery onto Russia. Now, over the last few days, obviously it's autumn, winter in Ukraine at the moment. The fog has settled, and that's meant that drones aren't that effective, and Russia has just poured forward. It's made life very, very difficult. But that's a tactical success. But strategically, Russia is struggling to make progress. And in answer to your question, I think a steady, managed withdrawal is probably the only option available to Ukraine at the moment. Does that mean this tactical victory by Russia is going to become a strategic victory? I very much doubt it.
And this comes alongside Russia still grinding forward in places like the Dnipropetrovsk. There's this ongoing air campaign by Russia. Several civilians killed in Kharkiv in the last 48 hours, including children. But does any of this movement on the ground bring Russia or perhaps Ukraine closer to an actual end to this conflict?
The short answer is no, unfortunately. If you look at the deadly attacks, overnight last night on Kyiv, I think there were 430 drones, if I recall rightly, and about 18 ballistic missiles. And Russia's been trying to sort of move gently towards 1,000 drones a day to be able to attack. Honestly, when I went to Kyiv was the day after one of the major strikes there, and my mum sort of worried that, what are you doing going there? And I said, hang on a minute. So I arrived in Kyiv, went out for an hour, grabbed a Costa coffee, spent an hour walking, didn't see one damaged building. It is worth remembering that this isn't quite London in the Blitz. It's some deadly attacks. It's tragic that people die, but the Ukrainian air defense system is working quite well around the capital, Kyiv. What Russia is doing is trying to make life as miserable as possible for Ukrainians, targeting energy infrastructure. In the middle of winter, it gets very cold in Kyiv. But more importantly, Ukraine's defense industrial base, its ability to make weapons, to make rounds, to make drones and missiles, has ramped up tremendously. All of those facilities need energy. Therefore, Russia is trying to attack that energy infrastructure. So all of this is linked. We tend to report, the media reports, on the tragic loss of life and Russia hitting blocks of flats. Those strikes do absolutely nothing to advance the war, and all they do is make the Ukrainians more stoical.
Well, Sean Bell, retired Air Vice Marshal, military analyst and co-founder of the Red Matrix Productions, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
It's an absolute privilege. Thanks.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.